block him at every turn. It's really about Congress, not so much the president.
Right.
Congress has the power. I mean, you could fix this in a week. Like, it's not hard. Like, have a clearinghouse for derivatives. You can see what's being traded, where the risk is going. Bring back a new version of Glass-Steagall, have a transaction tax, and then probably 4 other things that Michael could say too. But like, it's not hard. We had these rules for 40 years and we had no boom-bust cycle. And then all of a sudden we got rid of them, we deregulated them, and those are Democrats and Republicans did that. And then, boom, we're right back on this boom-bust cycle.
33, we put good reforms in place for which Glass-Steagall was the centerpiece. And from 1933 to the early 1980s, that's a 50-year period, we didn't have any of that, none. We kept the system steady and secure. And it was only as we started deregulating, you start hitting the...
Senators Elizabeth Warren, John McCain, Maria Cantwell, and Angus King, who just sounds like the mascot for Burger King or something, proposed to reinstate the Glass-Steagall Act. Now, this is great news. This piece of legislation is the single piece of legislation that if it was never repealed, which, by the way, it was in 1999, it would have prevented the Great Recession from being great.
So then you get some people who talk about the so-called repeal of Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall being a regulatory act dating back to 1933, and that this is the pertinent act of deregulation. But in fact, Glass-Steagall was only partially repealed, and the part that was repealed also had nothing to do with the financial crisis. Carnegie Mellon's Alan Meltzer said in 2009, quote, "I would challenge anybody to point to something important that was deregulated during the last 8 years. The last major financial deregulation was the 1999 act that President Clinton signed, removing the Glass-Steagall provisions separating commercial and investment banking. No other country in the world separates commercial and investment banking, and none of them have problems on that account. Nor have we had problems on that account," unquote. Bill Woolsey, another economist, says, "Glass-Steagall is a red herring. I think it is brought up because it is the only bit of deregulation that seems slightly relevant, and some people cannot accept that misregulation and entrepreneurial error, rather than deregulation, was the key source of the problem," unquote. So this partial repeal of Glass-Steagall simply meant that the same holding company could control both a commercial bank and an investment bank. But did the crisis of 2008 actually involve institutions that had both kinds of banking? The answer is so obvious that even the Washington Post had to concede the irrelevance of Glass-Steagall to the crisis. And here I want to share with you an extended quotation from the Washington Post. "Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and Merrill Lynch, 3 institutions at the heart of the crisis, were pure investment banks that had never crossed the old line into commercial banking. The same goes for Goldman Sachs, another favorite villain of the left. The infamous AIG, an insurance firm. New Century Financial, a real estate investment trust. No Glass-Steagall there. 2 of the biggest banks that went under, Wachovia and Washington Mutual, got into trouble the old-fashioned way, largely by making risky loans to homeowners. Bank of America nearly met the same fate, not because it had bought an investment bank, but because it had bought Countrywide Financial, a vanilla-variety mortgage lender. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan and Wells Fargo, 2 large banks with big investment banking arms, resisted taking government capital and arguably could have weathered the crisis without it," unquote. So what all this deregulation talk seeks to avoid is the simple fact that banks made bad loans. In other words, banks did a bad job at something they had always been allowed to do. There is no repealed regulation that would have changed this. Now, why banks would have made bad loans in a cluster and all at once is part of the subject of my book, Meltdown.
Research. If we want to look at the question, the actual empirical question, were these universal banks, the investment/commercial banks together, were they the problem, and did dividing them create a less risky banking environment? The answer definitively is no. When you look at the general failure rate during that period, the Great Crash period, for banks of all sorts, universal banks, investment banks, commercial banks, the general failure rate was 26.3%. But the failure rate for the universal banks, that is the banks that combined investment banking and commercial banking, was only 7.2%. They did much, much better than the general banking population, and they had higher profit margins. So that actually makes logical sense when you think about it, because as universal banks, they had not only depositors that they could do commercial banking with, but they could diversify their portfolio with their investments in securities and bonds and things of that nature. So they were less risky. They failed at a far lower rate. They had higher profits. In every empirical measure you can think of, the universal banks did better. So dividing those universal banks into investment and commercial banking, at least from that perspective of making the banking environment less risky and making these banks more stable, did not signally and demonstrably did not accomplish that goal.
Okay, so now let me read you this paragraph. It says, we got Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and Merrill Lynch, three institutions at the heart of the crisis, were pure investment banks that had never crossed the old line into commercial banking. The same goes for Goldman Sachs, the infamous AIG, an insurance firm. New Century Financial, a real estate investment trust. No Glass-Steagall there. This is from the Washington Post, which is not known for being anti-regulation, but there's a column from the Post from several years ago saying, if you're trying to look for a boogeyman, this one's just not going to work because it doesn't match up with the financial crisis we just endured. We did not have a problem with institutions, where we had a mingling of investment and commercial banking. That's not what happened.
That's entirely right. The whole Glass-Steagall issue is completely irrelevant to what happened in the financial crisis, and people have to really understand what happened in the financial crisis to understand why it is true, and that is everybody who got into trouble because they bought and held mortgage-backed securities or mortgages themselves. The issue of dealing and underwriting in securities was never a question in the financial crisis. AIG got into trouble by actually they insured mortgage-backed securities rather than actually holding them. Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Goldman to some extent, all got into trouble because they invested in, held, in other words, mortgage-backed securities or mortgages.
So in other words, they were doing something they had always been allowed to do. There was no phantom regulation that was repealed that suddenly allowed them to do these things.
Exactly. In fact, that's a really good way to put it, Tom, because if Glass-Steagall had never been touched by the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act in 1999, the financial crisis would have unfolded exactly the way it unfolded in 2008.
I get the sense, though, that some people who say what we need is a resurrection of Glass-Steagall, let's say we're talking about the more informed ones, their view might be, okay, you're right, it's not directly related to the financial crisis, but they seem to think there's some connection between the partial repeal and the rise of institutions that were too big to fail, that contributed to the creation of these gargantuan institutions. Is there anything to that?
No, because the ones that actually failed, there were three different institutions, different kinds of institutions that failed. There were the AIGs, which was in fact an insurance holding company, but it also engaged in insuring, in effect, with this so-called credit default swap. It was also insuring mortgages. That's one kind. Another kind was an investment bank like a Goldman Sachs or a Lehman Brothers or a Bear Stearns. They got into trouble because they bought and held as investments mortgage-backed securities. And then there were commercial banks like Wachovia or WAMU, that is Washington Mutual, known as WAMU, or IndyMac, three different kinds of commercial banks. They also got into trouble by holding mortgage-backed securities or mortgages themselves. So what we learned from all of that is that it doesn't matter what kind of institution it was or what kinds of laws applied to the way they carried on their business, but the fact was that they got into trouble by investing in these very low-quality mortgages.